Hi, Scott Mitchell from the Silver River Museum, and today we're talking about the U.S. Civil War. Now, before we get started, I do want to go over a few basic big picture items for some of you who may not be so familiar with this period of American history. So the U.S. Civil War was fought between the northern states and the southern states about 160 years ago, between the years of 1861 and 1865. It was extremely bloody and destructive. The country was literally torn apart, with people fighting their neighbors and in some cases family members even turning against each other. This was a dark time in our country's history, but it's also a fascinating historical topic. Let's go over a few terms that we'll be using in our discussion of the Civil War. First, the northern states are referred to as the Union or the Federal forces. The southern states were referred to as the Confederates, or the Confederate States of America. You'll also sometimes hear the North referred to as Yankees and the South referred to as rebels. The term secession refers to the process by which the southern states attempted to withdraw from the Union of the United States. They were basically quitting, saying, we don't want to be part of the United States anymore. We're going to form our own country, the Confederate States of America, and we'll have our own rules. This was because the northern states and the southern states were not getting along. They had been arguing for years over several key issues, and it finally came to the point where the South just decided to break away. In the big picture, one can say that the Civil War was fought for two big reasons. First was to preserve the country as a whole. The Union was fighting the Confederacy to prevent them from leaving, to prevent them from forming their own country, and to preserve the Union. One of the other big topics that people still argue about today is the issue of slavery, which is a dark period in our country's history. Now, as you walk into the history wing of the Silver River Museum and you turn the corner past the Timucuan Indian exhibit and past the Spanish Conquistadors exhibit, right there you'll see an entire exhibit case dedicated to the Civil War. And one thing you'll notice right away is that that case is full of weapons. Guns, swords, bayonets, bombs, artillery shells. There's even a small cannon in that case. Picture yourself living in 1861. It was a very scary time. Although the North was pretty much Union and the South was pretty much Confederate, the people who lived in those states, and especially border states, did not all agree. So you would have neighbors who sympathized with the Union living next to people who sympathized with the Confederacy, and when war broke out, things became violent quickly. The Civil War was a major event, probably one of the most important events in the history of the United States. So today, as we discuss the Civil War, our goal here is not to decide who was right or wrong or what was the exact reason for the Civil War. It's very complicated and it's a big topic. What we want to do today is give a good overview of the causes leading up to the Civil War, an overview of the war itself, and then talk about the period after the war, Reconstruction, where the country literally had to reconstruct itself. It had been torn apart by 4 years of bloody warfare. So let's start by talking about the causes that led up to the U.S. Civil War. You'll often hear that the Civil War was fought to end slavery, and that is partially true, but it's not the only reason the Civil War was fought. So let's look at the difference between the northern states and the southern states and some of the big causes that led up to the Civil War. So the northern states, or Union forces as they were referred to during the war, were much more populated. There were more people living there. There were a lot more factories. And this is important. The northern states had outlawed slavery in 1804. Now remember, the Civil War began in 1861. So the northern states had gotten rid of slavery almost 50 years before the war. Many of the northern states wanted the southern states to abolish slavery as well, and there was lots of arguing back and forth about whether this should be done or not. The leaders of the North also viewed the Union, that is, all of the states forming the United States, as being permanent. They didn't believe that states could just leave the Union if they decided to. They viewed it as a sacred, permanent institution that formed our country as the United States of America. The northern states also imposed taxes on the southern states, which basically meant that they collected money from deals where the southern states were shipping things like cotton and tobacco to other countries across the sea like Britain or France. Now, the South, or the Confederacy, or sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the rebels. The southern states were not as populated. There weren't as many people living in the South. There were not near as many factories. It was more based on farming and plantations. The South was upset by the fact that the North was trying to force them to do away with slavery, and they were also upset by these taxes on trade goods, which cost them money in their business dealings. The southern states were dead set to keep slavery because it was important to their economic way of life. And they also viewed their participation in the Union as optional. Southern leaders argued that when the country was formed, the states joined the Union voluntarily, therefore they could leave if they wanted to. And so the southern states began to talk about secession. Secession, or the act of seceding, means leaving. Eventually, 13 southern states seceded from the Union. That is, they left the Union and they formed their own country, which they called the Confederate States of America. Here's where primary sources come in, where we can really get to some of the facts about the true causes of the Civil War. Each of the 13 states that seceded from the Union wrote Articles of Secession. These were documents that listed their reasons for wanting to leave the United States. When you read the Articles of Secession, it is clear that one of the primary reasons, if not the primary reason, for the Civil War occurring was to preserve the institution of slavery. So as the southern states broke away and formed the Confederate States of America, tensions were at an all-time high, and it was basically a standoff between the North and the South. And on the morning of April 12th in 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which marked the beginning of the Civil War in the United States. Once the war had started, both sides began to build forts and move their armies around in an effort to win a decisive victory. We know from primary sources, diaries, newspaper articles, things like that, that both sides thought that they would win quickly and that the war would not last. It turns out they were wrong, and the war dragged on for 4 bloody years. Once war broke out, both the North and the South began to mobilize large armies, build forts, and put together navies to fight each other. The North was led by General Ulysses Grant, and the South was led by General Robert E. Lee. Forts were built across the country, battles took place across the country, but mostly in the South. And there was even a naval blockade by Union Navy boats that attempted to block southern ports so that ships could not come and go and conduct trade as usual. The hope was to starve the Confederate States of much needed weapons and food that were coming in by boat from other countries. In Florida, the coastal areas were mostly controlled by federal troops because of the naval blockade, and the interior or inside of Florida, away from the coasts, was pretty much controlled by the Confederates. Although the majority of men in Florida did join the Confederate Army, there weren't a lot of them because not many people lived in Florida at that time. So Florida became important to the Confederacy for supplying beef for food and sugar and salt as well to the Confederate soldiers fighting up to the north in Georgia and Alabama and the Carolinas and Virginia. One of Florida's most important contributions to the Confederate Army during the Civil War was actually food. Now, there were several battles in Florida, and the largest took place up by Lake City and was known as the Battle of Olustee or Ocean Pond. The Battle of Olustee took place when Union soldiers decided to march from Jacksonville to the west to cut a railroad tie and bridge that allowed the Confederates to move supplies north up into Georgia. The Confederate soldiers intercepted the Union force and fought a day-long battle in which the Union troops were driven back to Jacksonville in defeat. There were other battles that took place across Florida as well, but they weren't as big. When the Civil War began, the southern states were still allowed to legally own slaves. However, this was not to last. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a new law that basically freed slaves in the southern states. Now, obviously, the southern states did not recognize the authority of the North, so they ignored it. But the Emancipation Proclamation had a profound effect and actually helped change the course of the war. African Americans now knew that if the Union won, slavery would be abolished forever, and this caused thousands of them to join the Union Army to help fight. Free African Americans living in the northern states signed up by the thousands, spurred on by the famous recruiter Frederick Douglass, who would go around giving speeches about why they should join and help the Union fight. Other famous African Americans during the Civil War include Harriet Tubman, who worked for the North as a spy and as a scout and actually led some Union troops into battle. However, she was most famous for her work with the Underground Railroad, which was a network for escaped slaves from the South to make their way to the North. Many of these escaped slaves joined the Union Army, and by the end of the war, there were 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors fighting for the Union Army. As the Civil War drug on, it became increasingly clear that the North was outproducing weapons and had more fighting men. By 1865, the South was largely destroyed, and they were forced to surrender. Robert E. Lee surrendered his army on April 9, 1865, and soon other generals fighting for the Confederacy followed his lead and began to surrender as well. This marked the end of one of the bloodiest periods in the history of our country, and also formally and legally put an end to slavery. As the war ends, the United States enters a period we call now Reconstruction. It was literally putting the country back together. And the North and the South had to learn how to get along, and there was lots of rebuilding to do because mostly the South had been destroyed. A week after General Lee surrendered, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated on April 15, 1865. This sends shockwaves through a country that was already devastated by 4 years of civil war. And President Johnson, his successor, has to oversee the business of Reconstruction. What President Johnson does is leave federal troops in southern states as a police force for about 12 years after the war. One important task of the federal troops that occupied the southern states after the war was to make sure that the newly freed slaves were treated fairly. Former slaves were now considered citizens and they had rights like everyone else. African American men had the right to vote and could even hold political offices. During the early years of Reconstruction, there were quite a few African American leaders who were elected to political offices for the first time in the country's history. However, once federal troops left the South, these protections went away and African Americans were subjected to racial discrimination and violence for many years. As I said earlier, the Civil War was a major turning point and a very important era in U.S. history. It not only preserved our country, but it ended slavery in the United States forever. I hope these facts help you to better understand the Civil War and why it's important 160 years later in the year 2021. Until next time, I'll look forward to seeing you back for more cool history facts here at the Silver River Museum. Thank you.